Like many who were in public service in the 1970s, we understood the direct impact secure energy supplies have on daily life and prosperity in America and abroad. It was against this knowledge of the importance of the issue that the Baker Institute began its research program in 1995 with a major inquiry into the future of the Gulf and global energy markets. Today, more than a decade later, we revisit this important topic, looking more specifically at the important role of national oil companies of the Middle East. The International Energy Agency projects that over the next 30 years, $2.2 trillion in new investments will be needed in the global oil sector to meet the rising demand for oil. The question of who will be responsible for making these massive investments to fuel the future world economy is a critical one that is evolving with time. Over the past 30 years, privately held Western international oil companies with publicly traded shares were responsible for a majority of the world's oil production. Some 40% of new oil production over the past 3 decades came from within the OECD industrialized countries, with the majority investment made by these international oil companies. However, the IEA now projects that over 90% of new hydrocarbon supplies will come from the developing world in the next 20 years. The investment for this new oil production will come mainly from national oil companies, either traditional government-owned monopolies or emerging hybrid firms that are part state-owned and partially or recently privatized. This change will represent the major shift for international energy markets, one that deserves our careful attention. Also, the rising importance of NOCs will raise questions inside energy-consuming nations like the United States on how best to respond to the aspirations of national oil companies and to ensure that global energy markets remain resilient and competitive. In this context, the Baker Institute, together with our long and fruitful research partnership with the Japan Petroleum Energy Center, has undertaken a major 2-year study analyzing the strategies, objectives, and the performances of the NOCs. The study consists of 13 case studies of different NOCs and economic modeling studies aimed at assessing their operational efficiency. Today, we are very honored to release the findings of this study, and over the course of the day, you will hear from the academic scholars who have been researching this study over the past 2 years. We have brought together top experts to share their insights into the political and business culture of important NOCs and to discuss the geopolitical implications of the strategies of these entities. We also brought together important leaders from the Middle East to speak today on this critical topic. And so I would like to offer our deepest appreciation to His Excellency Mohammed bin Dahan Al Hamli, Minister of Energy of the United Arab Emirates and the President of OPEC, and His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamad Al Attiyah, the Second Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Energy and Industry of the State of Qatar, Sheikh Nawaf Sawad Nasser Al Sabah, Deputy Managing Director and General Counsel of the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. In this respect, there's a slight change in our program. Secretary Baker will speak, and after that, Minister Attiyah, and after that, Minister Hamli, because of their schedules. We are fortunate to have the presence of these leaders today, and we look forward to the opportunity to learn their authoritative views. Today's speakers will emphasize the Middle East, home to some of the world's most important NOCs, but their viewpoints reflect only a part of the complete study. The full set of study papers is available upon request or on the Baker Institute's Energy Forum website. Let me say that we also look forward to all of you in this room for your ideas, comments, and views that can contribute to the comprehensiveness of our study. This study would not have been possible without the generous support and partnership of the Japan Petroleum Energy Center and Accenture. I would also like to thank the Baker Institute Energy Forum for its support and participation in this program. It is the sharing of insights that has made our research so relevant and timely in considering future energy policy. Finally, I would like to thank our conference sponsors, Baker Botts LLP, Saudi Aramco, Accenture, the Petroleum Energy Center of Japan, Morgan Stanley, all for their generous support and participation. And I also want to note the important work of Amy Myers-Jaffe, who directs our energy program, for leading this effort, and to commend our Baker Institute staff for all the work that they have done. So in this context, I would like to now introduce a man who does really not need any introduction. He tells me if I introduce him for longer than 1 minute, I've lost my job. Join me in introducing James A. Baker III, the Honorary Chair of the Baker Institute.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Derigian. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'd like to add my voice to the ambassadors by welcoming all of you and extending the very warmest welcome to you on this conference on the changing role of national oil companies in international energy markets. This audience, Ed's already alluded to this audience includes some of the best informed and most influential figures in the world of energy today. Some of you come from government, others of you work in the private sector, but all of you are united by a common commitment to developing the Arab Gulf's potential as a premier supplier of oil and gas to the world market. I would like to join Ambassador Derigian in offering a special note of gratitude to those who have assisted us in this effort and to those who are speaking today. Some of the world's brightest minds in energy are gathered with us to share their thoughts on this important subject. I'm particularly pleased to welcome His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamid Al Attiyah, His Excellency Mohammed bin Ghanem Al Hamli, and Sheikh Nawaf Saad Nasser Al Sabah. Gentlemen, we are truly honored by your presence and we thank you for attending. Your presence will contribute greatly to our understanding of the importance of national oil companies in international energy markets. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic that we are here today to discuss, I think, makes one thing extraordinarily clear, and that is that NOCs are a complicated phenomenon. Certainly the best-known NOCs are based in exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait, like Venezuela. But NOCs of importing countries, most notably perhaps China and India, are increasing the financial scale and geographic scope of their operations. NOCs often work in both international and local markets. They run the gamut of up and downstream activities. Their decision-making reflects an effort, which is sometimes successful but sometimes not so successful, to balance economic and social objectives with commercial imperatives. And they embody a broad spectrum in terms of efficiency, profitability, and governance. In economic terms, NOCs play an important and increasing role in world energy markets. Today, and I think Ambassador Derigian alluded to this, NOCs hold nearly 80% of total global reserves of oil. They dominate oil production. Of the top 20 oil producers worldwide, 14 are NOCs or newly privatized NOCs. International oil companies, the IOCs, the world's largest petroleum producers throughout the 20th century, now have second-tier status. NOCs are increasing their importance in the 21st century, and assessing their emerging policies and priorities is critical to understanding the future of the energy industry. Of course, the challenge of meeting growing demand for oil is daunting. Consumption is expected to rise by more than 20 million barrels per day by the year 2030. The investment that is required to produce this volume could easily run to $2 trillion or more. And NOCs will be responsible for a lion's share of this increased output and investment. The picture, I think, is similar when it comes to natural gas. NOCs, or state-owned gas companies, already play a substantial part in international markets, and their role will become even more critical as liquefied natural gas expands its share of global gas supply. If NOCs are important in economic terms, they are also major commercial actors. They compete with each other and with major IOCs, and not just in their home countries, but increasingly all around the world. They vie for contracts, for finance, and for the full array of support services, equipment, and technology that are an intrinsic part of the contemporary energy scene. When Saudi Arabia opened the bidding for foreign investors in its natural gas sector, NOCs outbid US-based IOCs for major projects. NOCs are also making significant investments in refining and marketing, both in Asia and in the United States. Significantly, NOCs have overtaken the major IOCs in the value of their shares of stock traded on Wall Street. And not least, NOCs are also instruments of state power. Many of them serve as an important symbol of national unity and independence. At home, they are used with widely varying success as tools of economic development, employment generation, and social welfare. Abroad, NOCs can and have been used as instruments of foreign policy. Some governments see their NOCs as a means to enhance their international prominence, increase their influence, and foster strategic alliances. These three dimensions, you can call them economic, commercial, and strategic, are all elements of the growing importance of NOCs, and all three have raised profound questions. In terms of economics, for instance, many observers are concerned about the ability of NOCs to meet the growing global demand for hydrocarbons. I have already touched on the staggering amount of investment required over the course of the next 25 years. And OPEC production, which represents most NOC output, is lower today than it was in 1979. So bloated workforces, sometimes expensive consumer fuel subsidies, and debilitating political interference sometimes remain features of some NOCs. All of this reduces, when it happens, all of this reduces their ability to return the maximum production per investment dollar. Still, I don't think we should oversimplify. As I have mentioned, there are many highly effective NOCs, including several represented right here in this room today, like Saudi Aramco and Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. But the broader point remains. Unless NOCs as a group can increase their efficiency, world energy markets could be headed for a rocky future. There are also worries in the commercial arena. Here, concern has focused on the extent to which NOCs, through their close links with governments, might represent unfair competition to IOCs. In terms of proven reserves, traditional IOCs are already modest players. ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Royal Dutch Shell rank 14th, 17th, 19th, and 25th, respectively. I might note that IOCs have received some harsh criticism in the United States for their relatively low investment during the run-up in oil prices over the last 5 years. The reasons for IOCs' investment decisions, of course, are very complex. But one of them may well be the paucity of large-scale opportunities in hydrocarbon-rich areas, where access is limited to NOCs. And last, there is increasing concern about the role of NOCs as instruments of state power. Some observers see them as means by which governments can stave off domestic, political, and economic reforms. Others view NOCs as lifelines for rogue regimes such as Burma or Sudan. More generally, there's concern that the expanded international activities of NOCs mark the beginning of global conflict over hydrocarbon resources, as the great powers scramble to gain assets and access that they can tap in a crisis. None of these concerns is groundless. There are real economic, commercial, and political challenges associated with the changing role of NOCs, but I believe that they can be overcome. There is much to do, for instance, in improving the performance of NOCs. Partial privatization may be one option, but there are many other ways to increase the efficiency of NOCs. Greater transparency, improved governance, and the institution of good business practices can do much to enhance the effectiveness of NOCs. Consumer fuel subsidies remain a difficult issue in a lot of countries. At a minimum, their cost should be made clear. At best, subsidies should be phased out. If poorer citizens need income support, that support should be provided through the government's general tax and expenditure regime. As the study shows, countries whose NOCs dedicate too much revenue towards redistribution of wealth through subsidies and social spending may sacrifice their ability to reap the full benefit of their oil resources in the medium to long run. Today, some countries are experiencing difficulty in affording inefficient fuel subsidies that promote corruption, smuggling, and other criminality. Mismanagement in this area has even turned some OPEC oil exporters into importers. I believe that commercial concerns about NOCs can be addressed. Internal reforms are an important first step. The more transparent and the more businesslike NOCs become, the less likely it is that their governments will be able to use them to pursue geopolitical and other non-commercial activities. There's also vast potential for cooperation between IOCs and NOCs. The world, I'm convinced, is quite big enough for both, and both have critical parts to play in meeting future global demand for hydrocarbons. Indeed, one of the topics of today's conference is the increasing scope for innovative collaborations between NOCs and IOCs. Qatar's miraculous rise as the world's most important seller of LNG, I think, is an impressive case in point. Its world-class resources and business acumen, together with the project management and marketing skills of its IOC partners, enhance international market supply and stability. Cooperation will also be crucial to confronting the strategic challenges of NOCs. There needs to be much broader discussion at the governmental level of the global challenges we face in the energy arena and the best means to achieve energy security. If consuming countries feel more confident about the ability of international energy markets to supply their economies, they will feel less inclined to hedge their bets by using NOCs to build alliances with unsavory regimes. Likewise, producing countries will be less apt to use their energy resources to coerce neighbor states or trading partners if they feel secure in their access to important consumer markets and confident that the global system will bring a better life for their citizens. There is scope, surely, for more debate on the role of energy in the emerging global regime of liberalized trade and investment. And the United States, as a champion of freer trade and investment, has got to play a big part in that debate. Above all, we need to remember that energy is only part of the broader international picture. Healthy relations between countries permit the resolution of differences in the energy arena and elsewhere through negotiation and compromise. But if those relations deteriorate, then all bets are off. Then the actions of NOCs can become subject to more deeply rooted bilateral problems. The challenge of meeting the world's energy needs goes beyond the debate about the future of NOCs or IOCs. Global climate change has raised profound questions about our energy usage. I, for one, happen to remain totally unconvinced that the Kyoto Accord, for any number of reasons, is the best way to move forward. But, having said that, consuming countries, the United States first among them, can and should do more. Let me be very clear. Hydrocarbons, including oil and gas, will remain the backbone of global energy consumption for literally decades to come. And we must be wary of environmental policies that damage economic growth. But renewable resources are going to have to represent an increasing share of energy production. Here, the United Arab Emirates is showing true leadership through its commitment to solar energy and to clean power. Just last month, Abu Dhabi announced the creation of a Renewable Energy Institute, a joint effort between Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me stress my confidence in our ability to meet the challenges that I have outlined today. I am convinced that there exists broad scope for global cooperation in ensuring a steady supply of hydrocarbons to international markets. This cooperation may begin with governments like the United States and those here in the Gulf, who share a common interest in regional security and economic growth. But it must also include NOCs and IOCs joining together to bring their unique capabilities to bear in innovative and profitable ways. My message this morning is simple. It is in the vital interest of importing and exporting countries that our future, our energy future, be based on partnership and not on conflict. We cannot allow the Middle East, which is already home to such tragic violence, to become the scene of great power confrontation over energy. Countries and companies alike have a vast stake in the efficient and environmentally sound development of the world's hydrocarbon resources, especially so right here in the Gulf. Our task is to appreciate those stakes and to seek practical, productive ways to advance our common interests. I see today's conference as a first and very important step in what I hope will be a long and fruitful partnership. Thank you very, very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce our next speaker. As Qatar's Minister of Energy and Industry, Abdullah bin Hamad Al Attiyah has placed his country at the very forefront of the world energy scene. Already a major supplier of natural gas, Qatar is poised to assume an even larger role in global energy markets as it increases production, expands its LNG facilities, and embarks on an ambitious plan to exploit breakthroughs in gas-to-liquids technology. Qatar has also forged innovative collaborations with IOCs, a key subject of this conference today. Here, as in much else, Qatar has been a trailblazer, and our speaker has led the way. His appointment as Minister of Energy and Industry in 1992 and second Deputy Prime Minister in 2003 marked the culmination of a long and distinguished career in government and industry. He is a figure held in immense respect by government officials and business leaders alike, and he combines a broad strategic vision with a pragmatism born of decades of hands-on experience. Indeed, I am hard-pressed to think of any individual better qualified to discuss our topic this morning, the topic of energy markets, security of supply, and successful collaboration between NOCs and IOCs, than our speaker. He is also, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to say, a very good friend of the Baker Institute. He has been a frequent visitor in Houston and a popular speaker at Institute events, and we look forward to seeing him again in the future. And the reason is simple. He is one of the most authoritative speakers on global energy markets in the world today. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming the Second Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Energy and Industry of the State of Qatar, His Excellency Abdullah bin Hamid Al Attiyah. Excellency.
Mr. James Baker, honorable world leaders, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the very important subject of the security of supply and the collaboration between national and international oil companies. Over several decades, national oil companies were established in oil-producing countries to take charge of the hydrocarbon operations that were mostly run by the international oil companies. Since their inception and up until today, national oil companies have played some vital roles in their countries. These roles are clearly seen at both the economic and social levels. National oil companies have obligations towards their governments and communities who in fact own the national oil companies. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the national oil companies often generate the major source of revenue for the state. Secondly, they are the prime producers of energy products for the community and for local industries. Thirdly, they have a role in developing and training nationals so that their share in the national oil companies' workforce continue to grow. Historical international oil companies have had the leading edge over national oil companies with their advanced technology, project management expertise, commercial capabilities, and access to capital. This had enabled them to negotiate rewarding concessions deals with the national governments to explore and produce petroleum and natural gas resources. With most discoveries and increasing oil production, the exploration risk diminished, and oil-producing countries felt more confident and started to realize how valuable their natural resource for a hydrocarbon reserve are to the world. Gradually, the terms of the oil concessions started to change in favor of the host countries, and with it, higher revenue share for the host countries. Producing countries were heading towards reducing and eventually eliminating the role of the international oil companies by nationalizing all activities related to exploration, production, and export of hydrocarbons. The national oil companies were to become the sole operators in their countries. During the past few years, the gap between some national oil companies and the international oil companies has narrowed, as the national oil companies have managed to gain access to technology, skills, and capital market, which has meant that national oil companies can develop more of their own resources. National oil companies have developed excellent capabilities in managing resources, became more efficient and commercially focusing, and therefore are now ranked on par with major oil companies in their own rights. However, circumstances are not the same for all national oil companies. Some national oil companies have monopolistic control over their local market, while others are exposed to competition in some segments of the energy value chain. Some national oil companies are engaged in joint ventures with international oil companies, while others are not, as their governments remain reluctant to open up the energy sector for external investment. Hydrocarbon resources vary from one country to another in terms of quantities, type, and ease of extraction. Therefore, such differing circumstances have affected the performance of national oil companies and their relations with national governments and international oil companies. With the development of such competitive advantages, some national oil companies are investing in oil and gas operation outside the borders of their homelands. The success in operating and managing the hydrocarbon assets at home has given national oil companies enough confidence and courage to pursue projects globally. In their attempts to create further economic value for themselves, national oil companies now have a proven track record in seeking access to new markets for stimulate demands in existing markets that need their resources. This, however, has created a sense of competition with international oil companies who traditionally invest in exploration and extractions of hydrocarbon resource internationally. We all recognize that competition is good and makes companies more efficient. It also creates opportunities for cooperation between the national and international oil companies. This partnership will help ensure stability and security of supply in the energy markets as a shared responsibility. However, to achieve this, international oil companies have to offer unique technical and commercial capabilities that make extracting hydrocarbons more economic, and to pursue large, complicated projects which will give them the comparative advantage. In turn, national oil companies should continually develop their operational structures and technical capabilities to meet national obligation within the national policy and regulatory guidelines. Ladies and gentlemen, since the early 90s, Qatar Petroleum has entered into a number of production sharing agreements and equity sharing projects with various international oil and gas companies to exploit Qatar's oil and gas resources. These agreements are structured to be economically attractive for the international oil companies to develop and to exploit reserves in Qatar, while at the same time protecting Qatar's national economic and other interests. On the other hand, to create a market-friendly environment and more liberal and open economy, the government of Qatar has declared new laws and policies and offered several attractive incentives intended to make Qatar more receptive to foreign investment on all sectors of the economy. Primarily in hydrocarbons, under this reform, most commercial laws have been amended, such as tax exemptions and lifting of restrictions on movement of capital into or out of the country. With more than $80 billion worth of investment in energy projects during the next 5 years, Qatar is planning to further expand and diversify the production capacity of gas, oil, and petrochemicals. However, we believe that the exploitation of Qatar's reserves in cooperation with major international oil companies who have access to modern technology, marketing, and management skills is offering Qatar many benefits and helping us maximize production and export of oil and gas. Partnerships between Qatar Petroleum and international oil companies involve almost all of the petroleum projects in Qatar. In the crude oil business, Qatar Petroleum produces 1/2 of Qatar's total oil production, while the rest is generated by international operators under production sharing agreement to develop offshore oil fields. These companies include Occidental and Total, and our new major development with Maersk, which will increase the production capacity of all Al Shaheen field to more than 500,000 barrels per day by the end of 2009. Nowadays, the relationship has changed. Many large projects are extremely expensive. All companies, whether international or national, seek to diversify their portfolio of risk. We have therefore seen a world where international and national oil companies seek each other out and establish strategic alliance and partnership for their common good, based on fair return for their contribution to projects. Each picks the right partners for a particular project, and this is done right along the value chain of each project. To help the state of Qatar to achieve this aims, QP International has been formed. In the LNG business, companies like ExxonMobil, Total, Shell, ConocoPhillips are key shareholders. These companies are involved in almost all phases of our LNG project, from inceptions to engineering and constructions to sale and purchase. By the year 2010, total LNG productions capacity will reach 77 million tons per year, making Qatar the world's leading LNG exporter. With respect to GTL project, the Oryx was the first project in Qatar, which is a joint venture between Qatar Petroleum and Sasol of South Africa. The second GTL project has been recently launched between QP and Royal Dutch Shell, and it will be the world's largest integrated GTL complex. Similarly, petrochemicals projects have partners from several international oil companies. With this being said, I would like to conclude by assuring you that we look at our rich natural resource endowment as a source of income, as well as a contributor towards the security and sustainability of global energy supply. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Minister Atiyah. It's now my honor and privilege to introduce our next guest speaker, His Excellency Mohammed bin Dahan Al Hamli, the Minister of Energy of the United Arab Emirates and the President of OPEC. We are indeed fortunate to have you with us today. His Excellency Mohammed bin Dahan Al Hamli is the Minister of Energy of the UAE, a position he has held since 2004. He is also president of OPEC, where he served as UAE governor during 1994-2002. During that period, he worked at the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, where he served as Director of Marketing and Refining, Director of Personnel, Director of Marketing, and Director of Finance. He has also served as the General Manager of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company for Distribution, as a board member and vice chairman of the International Petroleum Investment Company, and as committee member of the Consultative Committee of the Supreme Petroleum Council. He has a degree from Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program. I had the privilege last night of having a dinner conversation with the minister, and I am truly bolstered and impressed by not only his intelligence, his understanding of this vast issue that we're exploring, but also his wise leadership for his own country and within OPEC at this very important time. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming the minister to the podium.
Thank you, Ambassador Georgian. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to deliver this address on the subject of international and national oil companies. Oil companies, whether national or international, are the central driving force in the oil industry, from exploration and production through processing and transportation to final marketing, sales, and distribution. The early 1970s witnessed the birth of the national oil companies we know today. Following the widespread nationalizations of the petroleum sector of the oil-producing developing countries, these actions took place to counter the long-standing dominance of the multinational companies at every level of the industry, where they control the quantity of oil extracted and sold, to whom it was sold, and at what price. Host governments were paid small royalties in contrast to the huge profits made by the multinationals. The comprehensive transformation of the oil industry since that time led to many new challenges for the oil companies, both national and international. Indeed, the picture has become an ever more complex one. Even the definition, terms of reference, and operating conditions of the NOCs or IOCs are not always as straightforward as they may seem to be. The oil industry is more integrated than it used to be, vertically and horizontally, and major advances in such areas as communications, technology, and dialogue and cooperation have eased some of the barriers and structural rigidities that existed in the past. Nevertheless, in spite of the closer relations among NOCs and IOCs that have developed since the 1970s, and the complementarity of many of their operations along the supply chain, there remain areas where further progress can be made. Two such areas stand out: perception of energy security and participation. The issue of energy security, as today's proceedings have confirmed, is still a matter of concern to some people. This is in spite of the heightened level of understanding of every security issues that has arisen in recent years, particularly through such bodies as the International Energy Forum, as well as the Energy Dialogue OPEC has been conducting with various parties. Of significance here is the reciprocal nature of oil security. It is as important for producers to be assured of steady, predictable demand for their oil as it is for consumers to receive secure, regular supplies. Contrasting scenarios developed at our Secretariat in Vienna depict differences as large as US $50 billion in investment requirements needed to increase OPEC production capacity expansion by the year 2010. The figure rises to $270 billion by 2020. These are very large sums to invest in these type of projects, especially for developing countries with acute economic and social developmental needs, without assurances that the new production capacities developed will be utilized. The huge amounts of capital that must be committed upfront and the long lead times subject producing countries as well as operating companies to a heavy financial burden. Not surprisingly, Such uncertainties can seriously impede the process of decision-making with regard to investment and production capacity in OPEC member countries, and the world is expected to rely increasingly upon this group of producers for its oil in the future. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is why OPEC repeatedly calls for more transparency in the evolution and implementation of energy policies of consuming countries, so that better assessment can be made of the appropriate capacity expansion needed to prevent wastage of precious financial resources required for the pressing development needs of oil-producing countries. The above-mentioned transparency would play a big part in supporting energy security in the future, as well as making life easier for oil companies in general. OPEC, ladies and gentlemen, through its market stabilization measures, its visionary forecast, and its dynamic approach to dialogue and cooperation, has demonstrated repeatedly over the years its commitment to stable markets, secure oil supplies at affordable prices, now and in the future. This is to benefit of the global energy community generally, as well as being supporter of steady world economic growth. Let me now turn my attention to the participation. In simple terms, the classic image of NOC is that of a specialist company established by government with the purpose of developing and managing its upstream oil sector and ensuring that the net financial returns are added to the overall wealth of the country for the ultimate benefit of its people. It is therefore answerable to its government. This contrasts with the classic image of an international company whose activities extend right across the supply chain, with a particular emphasis on the downstream sector and with operations all over the world, conducting business in competitive markets. It is answerable to its shareholders. However, in reality, there are differing levels of participation by the OECs in the upstream sector of oil-producing countries and an appreciable level of participation by NOCs in the downstream sector, both at the domestic level and abroad. With regard to the former, while government in some oil-producing countries have decided over the years to develop and operate their upstream sectors exclusively through their NOCs, others have opted for differing degrees of participation by the IOCs. These are all sovereign matters for the countries concerned. Greater NOCs involvement in the downstream sector has been growing recently, driven by bottlenecks in the refining sector of some major consumer countries over the past 2 or 3 years, putting upward pressure on the oil prices generally. Indeed, higher oil prices will affect NOC's IOC level of participation in different sectors of the industry. Higher oil prices increase the capability of producing countries to finance their own capacity expansion plans. It should be remembered that the IOCs are still heavily involved in upstream development in many producing countries, bringing considerable benefits to producing countries in terms of finance, skills, and technology, as well as access to international markets. However, even if there is a reduction in IOC's upstream involvement, there is still plenty of scope for participation of IOCs and other parties in the downstream sector. The important point to remember is, irrespective of price trends, there will always be sufficient investment in the industry to meet the forecast rising level of demand. All parties have a role to play in this right across the supply chain. Equally important for the industry is the need for collaboration between IOCs and NOCs on manpower, development, and training, because a large shortage of engineers and other key personnel is threatening the timely completion of essential projects to expand production facilities, especially here in the Middle East. Furthermore, such cooperation can also help bring down the high cost of services, which are creating further pressure on well-devised output expansion strategies. All in all, OPEC attaches a great deal of importance to this NOC-IOC's relationship. Indeed, this issue formed an important part of the long-term strategy of OPEC. We believe that successful collaboration between national and international companies can play an important role in helping the industry meet the many and varied challenges that lie before it, at a time when the consensus view is that world oil demand will continue rising for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to address the challenge of the NOC-IOC relationship from a different perspective, from the perspective of the IOC. R. Casey Olson is president of Oxy Oil and Gas Eastern Hemisphere, which means he manages Occidental Petroleum Corporation's producing operations in the Middle East and North Africa. He is also management responsibility for Occidental's worldwide exploration and international business development. Mr. Olson has had a number of positions in Occidental throughout the business, and prior to joining Occidental, he was managing director of CIBC Wood Gundy Securities Corporation. Allow me to introduce Mr. Casey Olson.
National oil companies and the implications these changes are having on our industry and the international energy market as a whole. This work is an extremely timely event and provides a solid foundation for ongoing dialogue at all levels. On a more personal basis, please let me say at the beginning that it's a fairly humbling experience for me to share the program this morning with individuals as prominent on the world stage as His Excellency Minister Al-Attiyah, His Excellency Minister Al-Hamli, and Secretary Baker. Following them to the podium is a daunting task and an opportunity that I expect I'll remember for some years to come. As many of you know, the Middle East is a core focus area for Occidental and a region where our company has had a great deal of success. It is also a region where we hope to significantly expand our strategic partnerships in the future. Much of our success in the Middle East can be attributed to our excellent working relationships with the national oil companies in each country where we operate and throughout the region as a whole. As I hope Minister Al-Attiyah would agree, the partnership since 1994 between Oxy and Qatar Petroleum has been a driving force behind the successful redevelopment of the Eid al-Shargi North Dome field in offshore Qatar. While Occidental serves as the operator of the field, QP is an active participant in the management process. Working together as partners, our combined technical expertise and creativity have generated significant new value for the citizens of Qatar through our collective efforts in this field. More recently, Occidental has developed another quite remarkable strategic relationship in the region. Starting our partnership with Abu Dhabi in the history-making transnational Dolphin Gas Project, continuing it through joint technical and financial investments in the Mukhaizna oil field redevelopment project in Oman, and most recently working together in the largest single exploration project in our company's history in Libya, we've experienced firsthand the importance of and the benefits that come from collaboration between IOCs and our government partners. In addition, we regularly exchange visits with ADNOC. We share technical knowledge and operating experience in areas where Occidental is considered an industry leader, such as utilization of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, as well as working together with them to support important technical research activity being done at the local university level here in the UAE. Although we could fill most of my time this morning talking specifically about these individual partnerships, my goal this morning is not to present a commercial for our company. Instead, I hope to take these quick examples and expand upon them in a way that addresses a broader perspective of the relationship between IOCs and state oil companies, ups and downs in the price of oil, changes in supply and demand. Sometimes they're all quite logically linked to each other, but often driven by factors which are not necessarily related. As the Institute's study clearly suggests, while we have a global economy and global geopolitical considerations that are truly global in nature, what may ultimately drive the actions of the NOCs that now control a significant majority of the world's oil and gas is just as likely to be their own domestic considerations. This is a critical point in understanding and appreciating the fundamental changes that are rapidly occurring in the nature of the relationships between IOCs and their state oil company counterparts. And so for the next few moments, I would like to provide you with some food for thought, perhaps, on the importance and value of developing long-term strategic partnerships between these groups. If one turns back the clock to the earliest examples of the working relationships between IOCs and host governments, you would find a very different world than we have today. Those early agreements were often perceived, at least from the government's perspective, as creating an unacceptable division of wealth from the project between the country and the company. As a result, many countries made major changes in the economic parameters governing these early relationships in order to redistribute the economic benefits from the successful projects. In some cases, actually, those changes were the vehicle for the creation of the state oil company. Unfortunately for the industry, some of those earliest relationships also formed the basis for a sense of distrust between the host countries and the IOCs, and often inhibited the potential for cooperation and partnership to their mutual benefit. As the Baker Institute study notes, the gulf between the immediate goals and objectives of NOCs when compared to IOCs has hindered partnering between the two entities in various settings over the history of the industry. Perceptions that IOCs are not interested in the broader goals of their NOC partners or are working against the needs of the host government's best interests have hindered relationships on and off over the past 50 years. Over time, however, the practical realities of the benefits achievable, the technology transfer opportunities, the IOC's willingness to take project risk, and the host government's desire to encourage foreign investment began to erode the barriers that had separated the two sides. Continuing changes to the economic format, like the introduction of the production sharing agreement in the 1960s also contributed to bringing down those barriers and provided a vehicle for the NOC to have greater ability to respond to its domestic considerations. While many of these changes provided dramatic improvements in the day-to-day business interaction, the fundamental nature of the relationship between the IOC and the NOC was still generally based on sitting across from each other at the negotiating table. Even where the state oil company took a direct participating role in the project, there was always the overriding role of regulator in some fashion, and that, really of necessity, still put the two entities on the opposite side of the table. Without a doubt, significant progress has been made over the years to improve that working relationship. But in many ways, the IOCs still have not taken enough opportunities to build true partnerships with our peers and colleagues in the state oil companies. A main theme of the Baker Institute study is the concept that the immediate goals and objectives of the IOCs and the NOCs are often very different, and that drives much of the interaction, or lack thereof, between the two sides. While I would probably agree with that view on a micro basis, if one actually takes a step back and looks at the issue from a very macro perspective, you find an ultimate goal for each that is actually much the same. The government and the NOC want to maximize the benefits to its citizens from oil and gas operations in the country. When you think about it, the principle is fundamentally the same for the IOC. One of its main goals is to maximize benefits from its oil and gas operations to its citizens, which, if you will, in the case of the IOC, is the shareholder. And while these objectives on the surface may seem to put us on opposite ends of the spectrum, they are not nearly as contradictory as they appear. Which I guess brings me to the first of the thoughts I would like to leave with you today. And that is, highly successful projects have a habit of being good for everyone involved. So the key becomes working together to ensure that success. That does, however, raise the fundamental question, and that is, can two parties who have been traditionally on opposite sides of the table, each seeking the best agreement for its citizens, effectively join hands, move around to the same side of the table, and work together as long-term strategic partners for the ultimate success of the project once the negotiating is done? We think the answer to that question is yes. But more importantly, we think that the answer must be yes if we are going to address the challenges we face as an industry as we move to the future. At Occidental, we believe that one of our core competencies is the ability to work alongside and as partners with our host state oil companies. Beginning with the earliest days of Occidental's first overseas developments in Libya, we have built strong and enduring partnerships with those companies. If I could, I would like to come back just for a minute to our history in Qatar to further highlight this point. In 1994, we entered into two key relationships with Qatar Petroleum. The first was a development and production sharing agreement for the existing Eid al-Shargi North Dome field. The second was a technical services agreement under which Oxy and QP could work cooperatively together to share technical knowledge that would benefit each in our respective operations in Qatar. As many of you who are familiar with regional oil and gas activities know, the ISND project was and continues to be a great success. The joint redevelopment efforts between Oxy and QP resulted in over a 5-fold increase in ISND production within a very short period of time. Most of this success can be attributed to the quick integration of Oxy and QP technical teams and work practices. The citizens of Qatar certainly benefited from the economic impact of this project, as did the shareholders or citizens of Occidental. Once again, highly successful projects have a habit of being good for everyone involved. As you might expect, in close working relationships, there are times when there will be strong differences of opinion between the partners. But frankly, these constructive discussions are no different than the ones we have within our own company. Done properly, NOC-IOC partnerships bring a multiplier effect to the effective use of technology, to gaining an in-depth understanding of the project, and to the application of what we learn from each other to our joint efforts. The projects we've undertaken with Abu Dhabi and Qatar are the success they are today because of the mutual trust, respect, and willingness to truly work as partners that exists between our respective teams. While the desire to optimize project benefits on both sides hasn't really changed over the year, how we ultimately do that is beginning to change. These changes are another significant step in the evolution of the relationships between the IOCs and the state companies. Historically, the IOC state oil company relationship was focused almost exclusively on one or more upstream projects. But as we learn each day, optimizing benefits from oil and gas operations for both parties may now require a much broader focus, including taking a detailed look at the entire energy value chain. In many cases, we now have to creatively work together to make sure that the value of an upstream success is fully realized by looking beyond just the upstream segment. There is no question that successful upstream oil and gas projects bring significant value to a country. But when some of those same projects are joined together with power projects, water projects, petrochemicals projects, and other users of that energy, there may be the potential for even greater overall benefits to both parties. This actually presents a new challenge for the IOCs and state oil companies as we work our way through business relationships that are a good bit different than we are used to. And this leads me to the second thought that I would like to leave with you. Simply finding the oil and gas is often not enough. It is here, as the Institute study points out, that the current level of IOC involvement in important downstream elements in expanding markets is a significant value add that can come from effective collaboration between both groups. Finally, a third area where the IOC-NOC relationship has changed is perhaps the most dramatic. Historically, it was very unusual for a state oil company to participate in projects outside its own country. Today, not only are many of those entities direct working interest partners with IOCs around the world, but in fact have become serious competitors for new projects. The Institute's study highlights numerous examples of large state oil companies that have stepped outside their traditional roles and now find themselves taking chairs on both sides of that negotiating table. While this latest development is one of the more significant changes to the traditional role played by state oil companies in our industry's history, and certainly presents an interesting challenge for us in the IOC sector, it also opens up a whole new world of opportunity for cooperation and partnership. It is an opportunity which we believe the IOCs must embrace with open arms by actively seeking out partnerships with NOCs in new areas. Combining the technical, financial, and geopolitical strengths of the NOCs with our own strengths creates an equation where 1 + 1 always equals something greater than 2. How many of the state oil companies choose to take this approach and how extensive their out-of-country activities become remains to be seen. One thing, however, is certain, and this is the third thought I would like to leave with you today. The clear lines defining the traditional relationships between IOCs and NOCs are no longer clear. The IOCs and the NOCs that recognize this, that actively embrace this brave new world, and find ways to collaborate effectively, will most certainly be the winners in our industry. I imagine that many of you might think of additional or better examples to illustrate my points than the ones I've used in these remarks. I certainly acknowledge that the points I've made do not necessarily apply to every country, every state oil company, or every IOC. Our intent has really been to simply stimulate some thought on how we as an industry can utilize the changing nature of our relationships to work together more efficiently and more effectively. Ultimately, the success of the project is what really counts. The state oil companies and the IOCs each have significant technical and financial capabilities. But we must continue to look for every opportunity to share our experiences, learn from each other, and to expand these new working relationships. In conclusion, I'd like to relate a very brief story about a conversation I recently had with a good friend in one of the major NOCs. We were discussing all of the changes that we had seen over our respective 25-plus year careers in the industry. We got like a couple of old fishermen as we traded stories about the projects that had gotten away from us and the projects that didn't get away from us. But we spent most of the time talking about how our companies' relationships with each other were continuing to change, had changed dramatically, and how difficult it can sometimes be to move that relationship from one where we sit on opposite sides of the negotiating table to one where we sit together on the same side as long-term strategic partners. As I got up and was actually walking out the door, he stopped me for a moment and he said, "You know, Casey, maybe the answer is to just recognize that the best relationship is one without that table separating us to begin with." My view, I think he's a very smart man. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce our last speaker for this particular session. We have partnered on many ventures. The Baker Institute, this conference is one example of our internationalizing our Energy Forum program. And David Asmus, who is our next speaker, has helped us with his law firm, Baker Botts, to bring our program on the road. We've been to Shanghai together and more recently to Moscow, and now we're here in Dubai. It's really a great experience for all of us, and we look forward to doing more programs around the globe in the coming years. David is a senior partner at Baker Botts. He is in charge of the firm's global oil and gas practice. His particular practice focuses on oil and gas development projects, acquisitions and divestitures, and energy-based financing. It's an honor to introduce David. He has received many, many awards in recent years, including the Chamber's USA 2006 Award for Excellence. He was named International Lawyer of the Year in 2005 for oil and gas by the International Who's Who of Business Lawyers. So it's with a great pleasure that I introduce my friend and colleague today, David Asmus.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Baker Institute and our hosts here in the UAE for this opportunity to participate in this fine program. Today, I will look at another aspect of NOCs, the challenges they face in participating in the commercial energy business, and how those challenges will affect their relationships with IOCs. National oil companies are a diverse group. They range from sophisticated and technologically advanced companies such as Petrobras and Aramco to entities that function as tools for implementation of broader state policies such as PDVSA, to entities greatly lacking in capability and experience, which are still found in broad swaths of the developing world. As a result, this talk will, out of necessity, overgeneralize. However, most of the points I mention will address factors addressing one degree or another many NOCs. So what are the challenges facing national oil companies in the first decade of the 21st century? To begin with, and perhaps surprisingly, given prevailing energy prices, in many cases a lack of capital for investment. In some nations, the national oil company is still a cash cow that is regularly milked to fund the national budget and must beg the government for funds needed to maintain future growth. By way of illustration, Pemex, the national oil company of Mexico, transfers approximately 2/3 of its national revenues to the Mexican state, funding approximately 1/3 of Mexico's budget. To maintain capital investment, Pemex is forced to borrow funds, notwithstanding its enormous cash flows, resulting in an aggregate indebtedness of in excess of $45 billion. The same effect is seen in Venezuela, where oil revenues fund about 1/2 of the total budget, and as the Baker Institute study notes, over 2/3 of PDVSA's budget is directed to social welfare programs rather than petroleum activities. The impact of state calls on NOC resources has been exacerbated recently by increasing prices of goods and services used in the oil and gas industry, requiring the NOCs to spend more money merely to maintain the status quo. Bureaucratic decision-making is a second factor that impairs the performance of some less effective national oil companies. Often partially shielded from commercial pressures, and in many cases readily adopting the management styles of the government bureaucracies that control them, these NOCs can become focused more on preservation of bureaucratic turf than on the rapid decision-making necessary for modern energy markets. If governments rarely manage commercial enterprises well, many NOCs have evolved only a step or two beyond their government parents. Any of you who, like I, have spent time over the years dealing with the Pertamina procurement process in Indonesia know what I'm talking about. Political interference is an unsurprising third factor that affects many NOCs. NOCs can find that their political masters are more interested in providing jobs or perks to favored constituents or subsidized fuels or social programs than in finding oil. Expert managers may be pushed aside in favor of political appointees to serve short-term political goals. The firing of 2/3 of PDVSA's managerial staff several years ago because of opposition political activity is only the most public example of this type of interference. Political pressure to perform may undermine NOC operations in other ways. In one recent major infrastructure project on which I worked, a member of the government negotiating team said to me during a break, "You have a much easier time than I do. If this project fails, you will suffer criticism and perhaps lose some money. If this project fails, I go to jail." It is hard to perform one's job in the best way in those circumstances. Finally, in a few cases, political interference may take the form of what I call interministerial warfare, as NOCs become political footballs in battles between powerful government figures for control and influence. If an NOC is perceived as being aligned with the wrong faction, the result can be an enterprise starved of capital, stripped of power or assets, or surrounded by restrictions aimed more at punishing the NOC's patrons than in promoting national interest. Corruption, which is the first cousin of political patronage, is a daunting challenge for some developing world governments, and NOCs are not immune from this problem. In some cases, management may become more interested in looting the nation's resources than in developing them, and such attitudes quickly percolate down the ranks. If rent-seeking behavior begins to overwhelm commercial motivations, the enterprise goes into stagnation and decline as interest and investment in the future evaporates. The personnel challenges that face NOCs do not stop with political interference or corruption. NOCs may have excess payrolls as a result of state requirements for the creation of jobs and political patronage, but at the same time may face critical shortages of key personnel. Patronage requirements themselves often interfere with attempts to promote the competent, and today industry conditions severely exacerbate this problem. High demand for technical and commercial skills in the industry, coupled with shortages of critical mid-level personnel in their 30s and early 40s, following extended dry periods of industry hiring, have generated a labor-starved industry in which signing bonuses and rising labor costs are a way of life. NOCs, as a result of their occasional capital constraints, are as a whole ill-equipped to compete for labor in this environment. I recently participated in a conference at which a senior official in a Latin American NOC spoke, and he implored the industry to stop hiring away the NOC's best and brightest employees because the industry needed a competent partner with which to do business. Please lower your salaries, he requested, only half tongue-in-cheek. Many NOCs, aside from the most prominent and successful, also suffer from a lack of access to, or in some cases, a lack of motivation to adopt the latest and most successful technology. While access to technology clearly remains a driver for significant NOC transactions with IOCs, NOCs continue to have a spotty record at best of actually implementing the best technologies in their own operations. For every Petrobras that can be pointed to as a leader in a particular technology, there are 3 or 4 other NOCs who desperately need to modernize. The reason for NOC's failure to do so is varied, but one overriding theme is that limits on competition limit incentives for innovation. Innovation is hard work, and when not forced to innovate, it is very comfortable for some NOC managements, like managements in any industry, to continue to pursue business in the same old way. Innovation also requires a long-term time horizon for analyzing costs and benefits, something with which some politicians who run NOCs may struggle. What are the consequences of this set of challenges? The startling, or perhaps not really so startling result, is that depending on how one calculates it, between 77 and 90% of the world's oil reserves and over 70% of the world's gas reserves, and perhaps a greater percentage of the most attractive reserves, are controlled by NOCs. However, these same NOCs account for only roughly 50% of the world's output. Looked at another way, NOCs on average produce only about 4% of their proved reserves annually, about half the figure for private industry. Given the state of world oil demand today, this effort is simply insufficient. It's instructive to look back in time a decade or two to the Soviet oil industry prior to the breakup of the USSR, because the inefficiencies in this industry have been studied in great detail. As a result of years of problems of the sort discussed earlier, by 1992, Soviet oil production was declining at a rate of greater than 10% per annum. Billions of dollars of capital, badly needed by the industry, were siphoned off and sent to foreign bank accounts. The technology in use was archaic. Equipment was unavailable or rusted in the fields. For example, in 1990, the prolific Tumen fields in Siberia suffered a 600,000 barrel per day drop in production, principally as a result of wells being shut in due to pipe and equipment shortages. A Center for Global Energy Studies report estimated that the Soviet Union lost over 5 million tons per year of oil production as a result of inefficiency. A McKinsey report from the late 1990s, after foreign investment had already begun to make itself felt in the Soviet Union, estimated that total factor productivity, that's a combined measure of labor and capital productivity, in the Russian oil industry was only 55% of that for the Texas onshore oil industry, which was a very old, mature province. If the favorable geology and younger fields of Russia were factored in, the total factor productivity in Russia was only 35% of that in the Texas onshore. This report cited, among other reasons for this productivity gap, lower recovery rates due to less hydrofracturing and poor reservoir management, inefficient drilling using low-quality bits, mud, and cement, and huge numbers of excess workers combined with poorly utilized idle equipment. While Soviet industry may present an extreme example, the same factors that afflicted it continue to afflict a number of NOCs today. Look carefully at these factors and you will recognize characteristics of some prominent companies. This is not to say that all NOCs suffer from all or most of these ills. I will simply note that many of those that are admired today, such as Petrobras, Petronas, and the leading Chinese companies, have exposed themselves to global competition, have shed many or all of their state regulatory functions, are willing to participate and learn from IOCs, and have international global influence on their boards, shareholding, or management teams. Some companies here in the Middle East, such as Aramco, are notable exceptions on several of these counts, but still manage to access IOC-level skills through joint ventures, expatriate hiring, foreign board members, and other means. In other words, aside from majority state ownership, many of these successful companies are, to one degree or another, trying to become IOCs. Unfortunately for some governments, the maintenance of control and preservation of a cash cow outweighs the desire to create an international champion. Now, what does all of this mean for the future of relations between NOCs and IOCs? Well, for one thing, in contrast to some pundits, and certainly in line with what the speakers have said earlier today, I do not believe the role of IOCs will disappear anytime soon. As the Baker Institute study indicates, IOCs will continue to offer interesting downstream partnering opportunities for NOCs seeking to expand down the hydrocarbon value chain. However, IOCs offer far more than that. A number of NOCs remain institutionally unsuited or struggle to develop the latest technology and the latest management innovations. They will need to rely on outsiders to periodically inject these quantities into their operations or risk facing the Soviet-style decline. Some NOCs will suffer from significant capacity limitations, which make it infeasible for them to play a leading role in joint ventures with IOCs. For these particular NOCs, this reality clashes with current political trends in which host governments expect to take the lead, and unfortunately brings the risk that these NOCs will reduce their ventures to a level of inefficiency that they're capable of managing. A few other NOCs, for political reasons, may choose to forego the risks that exposure to foreign IOCs and their business demands present, consigning themselves to a second-rate industry. The terms they offer will be unacceptable to the leading IOCs. Does Mr. Chavez really believe that Iran will bring him the latest and greatest technology and managerial techniques? Still other NOCs, the lucky ones, have become IOCs in many ways and will appear around the world as worthy competitors to the traditional group of IOCs. The ventures between these NOCs and IOCs will increasingly resemble commercial deals between IOCs, not international investment with foreign governments. Finally, a number of NOCs, a large number I hope, will recognize the opportunity that the current atmosphere of scarcity presents to them to form long-lasting alliances with IOCs, who are certainly more interested in secure access to NOC reserves than they've been for decades. I emphasize secure because if there is one thing that the last several years have taught IOCs, it is that not all NOCs are created equal. These enlightened NOCs will negotiate attractive but sustainable deals for themselves that will provide them with access to management skills, technology, and competitive thinking, while recognizing the need of IOCs for security and an attractive rate of return commensurate with the risks they're taking and the benefits they're providing. What are the lessons for IOCs from the challenges that face NOCs? There are at least three. One is that there's still a role for the IOC, and there should still be a desire on the part of a substantial number of NOCs to enter into partnering arrangements. The second is that IOCs must expect to provide much more than cash for the partnering to succeed. These days, the non-cash contributions may well be the more important ones. The third is that continued political management of a number of NOCs means that investment protection for the benefit of the IOC will continue to be a prevailing concern in many of such partnerships, including the negotiation of sustainable commercial terms, incorporating available legal protections, whether those consist of treaties, stability clauses, neutral choices of law, use of international arbitration, or otherwise, involvement of lenders and other potentially influential third parties where appropriate, and of course, wise choice of the NOC partner. And I will emphasize that again, as our hosts here in UAE can see from the great interest in the projects that they have, that IOCs notice when someone offers an opportunity for stable long-term investment. The challenges facing NOCs today are numerous yet diverse. There's no one-size-fits-all prescription for improving NOC operations or for making partnering with IOCs more effective. However, there are enough common themes for those in both the NOC and IOC camps to begin to make improvements in the way the aspects of the energy industry under the control of NOCs operate, and to recognize that the effort is best done together rather than apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, we have one opening keynote left, but we're going to proceed to a coffee break for a few moments to refreshen ourselves, so we're prepared for our last keynote. And I welcome you out to the foyer. Let me point out that there are copies of the Baker Institute study for those of you who haven't received it. It's of course posted on the internet too if you want to download, but we also have printed copies of our summary report and some of our key case studies out on the tables as well. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. It's a pleasure to introduce our last keynote speaker of the morning session. Sheikh Nawaf Saad Nasser Al-Sabah is the Deputy Managing Director and General Counsel for Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. He was formerly the General Counsel of KPC, and then prior to that was stationed with all of us in the U.S. We all enjoyed interacting with him when he was in Washington from 2002 to 2004. When he was in the States, he looked at the development of Kuwait's downstream business and also policy analysis for energy and security issues. It's, I think, appropriate to have a speaker from KPC today. KPC was, and I have to date myself, when I first came into the industry, KPC was one of the first, maybe the first NOC to branch out and start buying international assets and go into the international exploration business outside Kuwait. And then they, again, shattered the stereotypes by buying into the European downstream. So they've really blazed a big trail that we're now observing today about NOCs going international. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Nawaf and have him speak today about KPC.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The extensive policy study that the Baker Institute recently completed and is launching in today's session is an astute recognition, I would say, by the Baker Institute and perhaps I would posit by Amy herself, that the trend that started in the 1970s with the emergence of strong national oil companies continues today as we study how best to meet the energy challenges of the future. I applaud the Baker Institute for undertaking the monumental task of studying 15 national oil companies to determine essentially the factors that make them successful with respect to the goals that each of them is asked to deliver. And Amy, the list that you chose comprises, I would say, an impressive who's who of the oil industry, but I would take exception with one omission from the list, and that's KPC. It wasn't included in the list of NOCs that were studied, but I'm grateful and very grateful to you for allowing me this opportunity today to present our side of the story and perhaps add yet another case study to your report. To provide a framework for this morning's discussion, and in keeping with your case studies, I'd like to begin by briefly reviewing the structure of KPC and highlight some of the factors contributing to our performance in the quarter century since our inception. In this discussion, I'd like to share with you the various methods by which we at KPC are responding to the energy challenges and to provide secure energy for the world. And then I'd like to conclude with a few comments on some of the conclusions that were reached in some of the policy reports that are being distributed. Last year, we at KPC celebrated our first quarter century of existence. In those first 25 years, we transformed the Kuwaiti oil sector by bringing the disparate, pre-existing operating companies, such as the Kuwait Oil Company on the upstream side, Kuwait National Petroleum Company on the refining side, our oil tanker company, and our petrochemical companies, together under the common ownership and direction of a new entity, KPC. By doing so, we established an integrated corporation that made its business decisions on economic grounds. But we were not yet a fully global oil company. In the years immediately following the creation of KPC, as Amy has mentioned, we embarked on an ambitious and, for national oil companies, an unprecedented expansion program that saw us grow throughout Europe, in Asia, and even some portions of Africa. Our expansion centered on two pillars. First, vertical integration to maximize revenues from the Kuwaiti hydrocarbons that we produced in Kuwait. And second, parallel growth through investments in upstream projects as consortium partners with international oil companies. By leading the innovation wave in Europe in the early 1980s, KPC's subsidiary, KPI, Kuwait Petroleum International, grew to include 2 refineries in Europe and over 4,000 service stations in 6 European countries. You can see our fuel depots at Heathrow, Frankfurt, Charles de Gaulle airports, along with over 40 more airports worldwide. The same company is now pursuing a project to build a grassroots world-scale refinery and associated petrochemical facility in China, in addition to refinery investment opportunities in other parts of Asia and in the United States. KPI allows KPC a tremendous opportunity for a secure market for Kuwaiti crude oil to supplement the existing international marketing force at KPC in Kuwait. At around the same time that KPC joined the Club of Integrated International Oil Companies through its downstream operations in Europe, we also entered the international upstream business through another of our subsidiaries, KPC, Kuwait Foreign Petroleum Exploration Company. Now, I know that my colleague Badr Al-Khashti presented the KPC story at the parallel conference to this one in Houston on March 1st. But I'd like to highlight that this small company that produces about 62,000 barrels of oil a day, and last year recorded a profit of $250 million. It plans to reach 100,000 barrels of oil production in the next 3 years and grow its reserve base to 500 million barrels. Now, these figures are humble in comparison to those of KPC as a whole, but they are unique in the world of NOCs in our region. No one else is doing what KPC and KPI started doing in the early 1980s. Next year, we in Kuwait plan to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the discovery of oil in our country. Burgan 1, the wellhead, the first wellhead in Kuwait, continues to proudly produce oil today as it did over 60 years ago. Of course, back when Burgan 1 was first drilled, the oil industry in Kuwait was dominated by British and American interests. By the early 1970s, at the time of the nationalization of the oil industry in Kuwait, KOC production reached 4 million barrels of oil a day. At the time of KPC's formation in 1980, we were larger than BP in terms of production and operations, and in fact, later that decade, our government ended up purchasing up to a quarter of the shares of BP. In the meantime, however, even though we grew with the KPI and KPC stories I mentioned just a few minutes ago, BP grew at a much faster rate by effectively applying pure business strategies and technological advances. We, on the other hand, now have a crude production capacity of just under 3 million barrels of oil a day. The devastation, of course, wrought by Saddam Hussein's forces in 1990 and 1991 set us back a considerable number of years. But that alone does not explain why we now produce less than we did 30 years ago. Our reserves base is strong. It's greater than the figure that was available in the 1970s. And we're blessed with 10% of the world's proved oil reserves. So it's not a question of whether the oil is there. Instead, the issue is that our operations in Kuwait have not kept pace with the requirements of international business. When we were formed in 1980, KPC held a special position within Kuwait and under Kuwaiti law. We had a great deal of operational flexibility and autonomy that allowed us to make bold moves in the international markets. Over the years, however, we saw our autonomy erode and our flexibility rigidify. We became subject to greater governmental oversight that rendered a repetition of the market capturing moves of the 1980s almost impossible today. Up until last year, none of our subsidiaries, the companies such as KOC, KNPC, and others, could make a procurement of over $17,000 without having to go through a public tender that was managed by a state agency. This applied to everything from new crackers for our refineries to even a company-wide order for No. 2 pencils. Thankfully, the Supreme Petroleum Council last year, and that's the government authority that oversees the oil sector and sets the broad petroleum policy of the state, agreed to our request to provide our operating companies much greater flexibility. They are now able to run their own procurements up to $17 million internally. That makes for a lot of No. 2 pencils. Similarly, whereas capital expenditure decision-making for subsidiaries once centralized in KPC's corporate planning department, we now have pushed these types of decisions down to the operating levels where the operating companies are better suited to make these types of decisions. I'm told that companies such as ExxonMobil or perhaps even BP may need about 6 or 7 approvals in-house to greenlight a project. 2 years ago, we did a count of these internal approvals within Kuwait that are needed for KPC to greenlight a similar type of project, and we reached 32. Opportunities obviously passed us by because of those rigidities, and because also of our inability to act upon the opportunities that were presented to us. So that's why we have streamlined our decision-making process. All of these reforms are part of our new strategic management philosophy, whereby we hope to transform KPC, the parent company, into a smaller, more efficient organization that formulates and coordinates our hydrocarbons energy policy among our operating subsidiaries and allows these subsidiaries to implement the strategies with little interference from the parent. Having set and processed the plan to put our internal house in order at KPC, we're now concentrating on how to continue to be responsible corporate citizens within the Kuwaiti economy and within Kuwaiti society as well. We employ over 13,000 Kuwaitis 13,000 workers in the oil sector, and I'm proud to say that over 80% of those employees are Kuwaiti citizens. But we also employ about 17,000 contractors who work with us, and unfortunately fewer than 5% of those contractors' workforces are Kuwaiti. We're the largest civilian employer in Kuwait, but because our industry is more capital intensive than labor intensive, we only create about 500 new jobs a year. For example, our new aromatics plant will cost about $2 billion to come online, but it will only create about 300 full-time jobs. Meanwhile, 15,000 young Kuwaitis will be entering the Kuwaiti workforce this year. And the challenge for our country and for KPC in general, and in particular, will be to provide new jobs for these workers. We're doing our part by updating our contracting procedures to require a gradual escalation of the minimum Kuwaiti contingency of contractor workforce to increase over the years to 25%. This requirement is actually stricter than that under Kuwaiti law. On the corporate governance front, we're proud last year to have been the first state-owned institution and one of the first Kuwaiti businesses to adopt and implement a code of conduct covering ethical business dealings. Immediately after launching our code with significant fanfare in Kuwait, we received requests from other Kuwaiti companies and even from the Kuwaiti civil service authorities to learn from our practice and adopt our code. More on the corporate governance side, we have created standing audit and compensation committees on our boards of directors composed solely of outside directors. We've instituted a senior management annual incentive program to spur our executives to innovate and to take the risks necessary to meet ambitious annual goals. We're hoping to lead the Kuwaiti business sector, both the public sector and the private sector, by example. And from the international perspective, KPC must also lead in the creation of suitable additional production capacities to meet tomorrow's energy needs. We recognize that the world energy consumption is projected to increase by about 50% over the next quarter century. And most of the additional barrels of oil will be coming from Gulf producers. To meet this challenge, we are implementing a business strategy that will take us to 2020 and beyond. This strategy is based on 4 key components. First, we must expand our crude production capacity to reach 4 million barrels of oil a day by the year 2020. Our current capacity stands at around 2.8 million barrels today. This 4 million barrel a day figure would match the production figures that we had reached in the 1970s. But while the oil production at that time was came solely from easy to produce reservoirs, the incremental production that would take us to 4 million barrels by 2020 would come from the more difficult reservoirs. To achieve these production targets, we must cooperate with the IOCs. This cooperation is manifested in a giant project in Kuwait in which we plan to invite the international oil companies to operate our northern oil fields to increase production from those fields to 900,000 barrels a day. Those reservoirs hold as much as 10 billion barrels of oil, and we estimate that it would cost about $8 billion of investment to reach the 900,000 barrels of oil production a day. We also then hope to maintain that plateau as long as possible while preserving the integrity of the reservoir and maximizing the recoverable reserves within those fields. We've been producing oil for more than 60 years, but almost all of that oil production has been primary production. To meet the challenge of providing still more energy to the world economy, we need to expand our production to include more sophisticated practices to produce crude from our heavier crude reservoirs, which are more complex and have a higher water cut. For example, at a crude production of 4 million barrels a day, which is what we hope to achieve by 2020, we anticipate that we will be producing 10 million barrels of water at the same time. The management of that additional water production, with all the corrosive effects that it would have on the industry, is a challenge for us to address. That is why the participation of international oil companies in our future investments is critical. We remain committed to working with our Parliament to move this project forward. The second element of our 2020 strategy is to expand domestic refining capacity to reach 1.5 million barrels a day by building a new giant refinery in southern Kuwait. We hope to have this refinery on stream by 2010 in order for us to meet the stricter environmental standards imposed by EU regulations. Third, we aim to expand our international operations through KPI, KOFPEC, and the Petrochemical Industries Company. And we're proud of the petrochemicals partnership we have with the Dow Chemical Company, with whom we jointly operate an olefins plant in Kuwait, plus an additional one coming online in the next few years, as well as 3 similar types of plants in Canada. We hope to build upon this JV model in other international petrochemical operations. And fourth, we want to accomplish all of these goals while meeting the energy needs of our domestic economy. To that end, we will soon announce a plan to develop the 36 trillion cubic feet of gas that we discovered last year. And this non-associated gas field should satisfy our domestic industrial and power generation needs for the foreseeable future. Fully implemented, this entire strategy will take us beyond 2020 at a cost of $64 billion. As you can see, we at KPC have set into motion 2 vital programs to transform the way we do business. First, internally, we are implementing the strategic management business model to return KPC to the dynamic and innovative entity that it was upon its creation 25 years ago. And second, we are pursuing a new long-term strategy to meet the world's growing energy demands. These 2 programs and our ability to realize the goals therein pose a direct challenge to a couple of theories presented in a few of the studies that the Baker Institute issued. First, I agree with a number of our previous speakers that the NOCs and the IOCs do pursue different goals. Yet the study that was titled A Model of the Operation and Development of a National Oil Company posits that because NOCs ultimately answer to political stakeholders, we then shift extraction of the resources away from the future towards the present. In fact, I would posit that it's the other way around. where IOCs are driven to maximize their profits, and these are usually quarterly profits by the skewed demands that Wall Street imposes upon companies. Well-functioning NOCs are driven to maximize the lifetime of the overall fields and the overall resource base. That has been our concern in creating incentives in our Kuwait project to align the interests of the IOCs with those of the state. Second, the study concludes that the strategies and policies of NOCs and their host governments, including interference in the NOC operations by politicians and other localized communities, will have substantial long-term impact on resource development and national wealth in the coming years. Well, we in KPC don't see the political process as necessarily counterproductive. KPC is audited annually not only by a financial auditor, and these audits are available publicly, but we're also audited by the State Audit Bureau, which presents its reports to Parliament. The Bureau's comments on KPC and our subsidiaries, which filled over 300 pages of text last year, provide for full transparency in our operations, thereby reducing corruption and political interference in our operations. And they also allow us a wonderful opportunity to discuss and explain our strategies to parliamentarians in Kuwait. As a result, we are better able not only to provide barrels to the national economy, but also to contribute positively to the national wealth through safe, environmentally friendly operations that attract Kuwaiti workers. These comments are not criticisms of the report. Instead, they are reactions and reflections from the perspective of one NOC that has a particular and perhaps unique situation governing its operations. While we may not always successfully juggle the two requirements that are imposed upon us on KPC, one, to maximize the return on our oil wealth, and two, to contribute positively to the Kuwaiti economy, to the Kuwaiti society, and to the environment, we are relieved to have a government that stresses professionalism in the oil sector and a management team that is committed to conducting its business with integrity. Thank you very much.